A family's legacy, steeped in pride and tradition, crumbled in ways no one could have foreseen. It started with something mundane, a summer visit, two teenage siblings sent to stay with their widowed aunt while their parents were away on business. A simple arrangement meant to foster connection, to bridge the gap of years spent apart. But in that quiet house, something sinister waited, something no one could have predicted. Margaret Hensley, alone for over a decade since her husband's death, had grown accustomed to the silence of her home. Her children had long since moved away, her friends had faded into the background, and her days were filled with a weight of solitude. She never imagined that this visit, this chance to reconnect with her niece and nephew, would spiral into something unthinkable. When Lila and Ethan arrived, everything shifted. At first, it was subtle, a strange tension in the air, a discomfort that seemed fleeting. But as the days unfolded, that tension grew, twisting simple moments into something heavy, something wrong. Margaret, once a pillar of strength, began to question everything she knew about family, about herself. Lila and Ethan, now 18, were no longer the children she remembered from years past. They were bold, self-assured, carrying an energy that unsettled her in ways she couldn't articulate. 2 weeks, that's all it was meant to be. A brief stay, a return to normalcy. But sometimes, 2 weeks is enough to unravel everything. Sometimes, what seems innocent can turn deadly. A secret emerged, one that should never have existed, tearing apart the bonds of trust, love, and family. How far can those bonds stretch before they snap? And when they do, who is left to face the wreckage? Stay with us, for this is where the nightmare begins. Margaret Hensley, in her late 60s, was a woman whose name once carried weight in her small community. Known for her resilience, her grace under pressure, she had weathered life's storms with dignity. But the loss of her husband, Thomas, 12 years prior had left a void that nothing could fill. Their home, once filled with the warmth of shared meals and lively conversations, had become a mausoleum of memories. Thomas had been her anchor, the one who made the world feel steady no matter the chaos. Together, they had raised 2 daughters, built a life of love and laughter, and welcomed grandchildren into their world. But when Thomas passed, the light in Margaret's life dimmed. The house grew too large, too empty, and the silence became a constant companion. Raised in a strict, traditional household, Margaret had been taught to value family above all else, to live with integrity, to uphold a moral code that guided every decision. Those values had carried her through marriage, motherhood, and beyond. But in the years following Thomas's death, that moral compass began to waver. Loneliness is a quiet predator, creeping into the corners of a life left unattended. At first, it was just a pang, a fleeting thought in the stillness of the night. But as months turned into years, it grew louder, more insistent, until it was all Margaret could hear. Her once vibrant social circle had dwindled, her days spent tending to a garden that no longer brought her joy, her nights spent staring at the ceiling, longing for connection. And then came the visit, a chance to break the cycle, if only for a moment. Lila and Ethan Hensley, the teenage children of Margaret's younger sister, Clara, arrived at her doorstep with duffel bags slung over their shoulders. At 18, they were no longer the shy, giggling children Margaret remembered from family gatherings. They were twins, not identical but strikingly similar, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Lila, sharp-witted and quick to smile, had a way of commanding a room. Ethan, quieter but no less bold, carried himself with a self-assuredness that made Margaret uneasy. Their parents, Clara and James Hensley, were successful academics, often traveling for conferences or research projects. This time, a joint trip to Europe had left them no choice but to send their children to stay with Margaret. It was a practical decision, a chance for the twins to spend time with their aunt, for Margaret to escape her isolation. Clara, however, had reservations. Her relationship with Margaret had always been strained, a mix of admiration and resentment. Margaret had been the stricter sibling, the one who enforced rules, who upheld the family's rigid standards. Clara, more free-spirited, had often clashed with her sister's sense of duty. Now, leaving her teenage children in Margaret's care for 2 weeks felt like a gamble. She trusted her sister, but something about the arrangement gnawed at her, a vague unease she couldn't shake. Still, the decision was made. It was only 2 weeks. What could go wrong? Margaret was thrilled at the prospect of company. The thought of her niece and nephew filling the house with life again gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She prepared their rooms, stocked the kitchen with their favorite snacks, and planned outings to keep them entertained. But when they arrived, something felt off. Lila and Ethan were taller, stronger, more self-assured than she'd expected. They moved through the house with an ease that felt almost intrusive, lounging on the couch in casual, revealing clothes, their laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. Margaret tried to dismiss her discomfort, all. They were just being themselves, Margaret told herself, trying to quell the unease that stirred within her. But there was something about their presence, their ease in her space, that felt too bold, too intimate. She asked them to dress more modestly, to respect the boundaries of her home, but Lila would laugh it off, tossing her hair with a playful smirk, while Ethan would shrug, his eyes meeting hers for a moment too long. Margaret tried to focus on the normalcy of their visit, cooking meals, sharing stories of their childhood, but the air grew heavier with each passing day. She couldn't ignore the way her heart quickened when they were near, the way her thoughts wandered to places they shouldn't. It had been so long since she'd felt anything but emptiness, so long since anyone had looked at her with anything resembling warmth. The loneliness that had consumed her for years was a tide, pulling her under, and she was powerless to resist. Lila and Ethan, for their part, seemed to sense her vulnerability. They were young, yes, but not naive. Growing up in a world of privilege, they were accustomed to getting what they wanted, to pushing limits just to see how far they could go. In Margaret's quiet, orderly home, they found a new kind of challenge. It started innocently enough, a lingering touch on her shoulder as Lila passed her in the kitchen, a too-close lean from Ethan as they watched a movie on the couch. Margaret told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things. But the moments multiplied, each one more deliberate than the last. She caught herself watching them, noticing the way Lila's laughter filled the room, the way Ethan's quiet intensity seemed to draw her in. She hated herself for it, for the thoughts that crept into her mind late at night when the house was still. These were her niece and nephew, her family. But the loneliness was a beast, and it was winning. One evening, as the summer heat hung heavy in the air, Margaret sat in her armchair, a book open on her lap but unread. In the next room, Lila and Ethan were sprawled on the floor, playing a card game, their laughter sharp and unrestrained. The sound should have been comforting, a reminder of life in her too quiet home. But instead, it stirred something else, something she couldn't name. She glanced toward them, their silhouettes illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp. Lila's hair fell over her shoulder, catching the light, while Ethan's bare arms flexed as he tossed a card onto the pile. Margaret's breath caught, her book slipping from her hands. She tried to look away, to focus on anything else, but her eyes betrayed her, lingering on their easy confidence, their youth, their vitality. It was wrong, she knew it was wrong, but the feeling was there, undeniable, growing stronger with every heartbeat. Lila noticed first. She glanced up, catching Margaret's gaze, and instead of looking away, she held it. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face, and Margaret felt a chill run through her. "What's wrong, Aunt Maggie?" Lila asked, her voice teasing, almost challenging. Margaret stammered, her face flushing, but before she could respond, Ethan looked up too, his expression unreadable but intense. "Yeah, you okay?" he added, his tone softer but no less pointed. Margaret's heart pounded. She wanted to stand, to leave the room, to break the spell, but her body wouldn't move. The twins exchanged a glance, a silent communication that Margaret couldn't decipher, and in that moment, something shifted. The air grew thick, charged with an unspoken understanding that none of them wanted to acknowledge. Dinner that night was a quiet affair, the usual chatter replaced by a tension that pressed against Margaret's chest. She sat across from Lila and Ethan, her hands trembling as she passed the serving dishes. Lila's foot brushed against hers under the table, a fleeting touch that could have been accidental but wasn't. Margaret froze, her fork hovering over her plate. She told herself to say something, to set boundaries, but the words wouldn't come. Ethan, sitting to her right, reached for the salt, his arm grazing hers, lingering just a moment too long. Margaret's pulse raced, her mind screaming at her to stop this, to end it before it went any further. But she didn't. She couldn't. The loneliness, the need for connection, had taken root, and it was stronger than her will. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, Margaret found herself standing outside the guest room where Lila and Ethan slept. She didn't know why she was there, didn't want to admit the pull that had brought her down the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear their voices, low and conspiratorial, punctuated by soft laughter. She should have turned away, should have gone back to her room, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and the twins looked up, their faces illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. "Can't sleep, Aunt Maggie?" Lila asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and something darker. Ethan sat up, his expression unreadable but not unwelcoming. Margaret's throat tightened, her mind a storm of guilt and desire. She took a step forward, then another, and in that moment, she crossed a line she could never uncross. The days that followed were a descent into chaos. What began as a moment of weakness became a secret that consumed them all. Lila and Ethan, emboldened by Margaret's vulnerability, pushed further, testing boundaries she was too weak to enforce. The house, once a place of refuge, became a cage, each room filled with the weight of their shared transgression. Margaret tried to stop it, to reclaim the woman she had been, but the twins had seen her weakness, and they used it. They whispered words that made her feel wanted, touched her in ways that blurred the lines of family. She was drowning, caught in a web of her own making, and the guilt was a constant shadow, following her every step. She thought of Thomas, of the life they had built together, and the shame nearly broke her. But the pull of the twins, their youth, their attention, was too strong, and she was too far gone to pull back. Clara and James were due to return in just a few days, but the secret was growing harder to contain. Neighbors stopped by, their visits unannounced, and Margaret's heart raced each time the doorbell rang. She smiled, made small talk, all while Lila and Ethan lingered just out of sight, their presence a constant threat. Phone calls from Clara were worse, each one a tightrope walk, Margaret's voice strained as she lied about how well the visit was going. The twins, reckless in their confidence, seemed to thrive on the danger, their boldness pushing Margaret further into the abyss. One afternoon, as she stood at the door chatting with a neighbor, she felt Ethan's presence behind her, his breath warm against her neck as he whispered something too low for the neighbor to hear. Margaret's smile faltered, her hands trembling as she ushered the neighbor away, praying the secret hadn't been seen. But secrets like theirs couldn't stay hidden forever. Clara and James returned early, their trip cut short by a cancelled conference. They hadn't called ahead, wanting to surprise their children, to see the smiles on their faces after weeks apart. But as they pulled into the driveway, the house was too quiet, the air heavy with something unspoken. Clara's unease, the doubt that had lingered when she left her children with Margaret, returned with a vengeance. She called out for Lila, for Ethan, for Margaret, but no one answered. The silence was oppressive, broken only by a faint sound from upstairs, laughter, and the soft rush of water. Clara's heart sank as she climbed the stairs, James close behind, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The bathroom door was ajar, steam spilling into the hallway. Clara's voice trembled as she called out again, but the laughter continued, oblivious to her presence. She pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted her shattered everything she knew. There, in the shower, were Lila, Ethan, and Margaret, their bodies too close, their actions unmistakable. The laughter stopped, replaced by a stunned silence as the twins and their aunt turned to face her. Clara's world collapsed. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes saw. James stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of horror. "What is this?" Clara's voice was a raw scream, tearing through the silence. She didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed Lila, then Ethan, pulling them from a shower, her hands shaking with rage. "Get out! Both of you!" she shouted, throwing towels at them. Margaret stood, water dripping from her, her face pale with guilt. "Clara, please," she stammered, but Clara's fury was a wall, impenetrable. "Don't you dare," Clara spat, her voice thick with betrayal. "You're my sister. They're my children." The words were a knife, cutting through the air, through the bond they had once shared. James stepped forward, his voice low and strained. "Get dressed," he told the twins, unable to look at them. Lila and Ethan, their faces pale, scrambled to cover themselves, their confidence replaced by shame. Clara turned to Margaret, her eyes burning. "How could you do this? How could you destroy us?" Margaret's lips moved, but no words came. There was no explanation, no defense. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. Clara stormed out of the bathroom, her children trailing behind, their heads bowed. Margaret, desperate, grabbed a towel and followed, her voice breaking as she pleaded. "Clara, wait. Let me explain." But Clara didn't stop. She didn't turn back. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, each one a declaration of finality. Margaret's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of panic and guilt. She couldn't let them leave like this, couldn't let the last memory of her be one of betrayal. "Clara, please," she cried, her voice cracking as she stumbled after them, the towel slipping from her trembling hands. Her bare feet, still wet from the shower, skidded on the hardwood floor as she hurried toward the stairs. James, his face tight with disbelief, guided Lila and Ethan toward the front door, his voice low but firm. "We're done here," he said, his words cutting through the air. Clara's rage was a living thing, her body trembling as she moved, her children silent behind her, their shame palpable. Margaret reached the top of the stairs, her breath ragged, her vision blurred by tears. "Don't go! You don't understand," she pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. But Clara's steps didn't falter. "We're leaving, Margaret," she said, her voice cold as ice. "And we're never coming back." The word struck like a physical blow, stealing the air from Margaret's lungs. She took a step forward, her foot catching on the edge of the top stair. The world tilted. Her arms flailed, reaching for the banister, but her fingers grasped only air. Time slowed as her body pitched forward, her frail frame twisting in a helpless arc. The sound of her fall was deafening, a sickening thud as her head struck the edge of a stair, followed by the crack of bone against wood. She tumbled, lifeless, to the bottom, her body crumpling in a heap, blood pooling beneath her head, spreading across the floor like a dark accusation. For a moment, no one moved. Clara, James, Lila, and Ethan stood frozen, their minds unable to process the horror before them. The anger, the betrayal, all dissolved in the face of this new, unbearable reality. "Margaret!" Clara's voice was a broken whisper, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She rushed down the stairs, dropping to her knees beside her sister, her hands hovering over the still form, afraid to touch. Blood seeped into the cracks of the floor, staining Clara's fingers as she reached out, her breath hitching in a sob. "No, no, no," she whispered, shaking her head as if she could will the moment away. James snapped out of his shock, his voice sharp. "Call an ambulance," he shouted to Ethan, who fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. Lila stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, unable to look away from the scene below. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. Margaret was gone, her body still and cold, the woman who had once been the heart of her family reduced to a tragic memory. The hospital's sterile lights did nothing to soften the reality. Clara sat in the waiting room, her hands stained with her sister's blood, her mind replaying the moment over and over, the fall, the sound, the silence that followed. James sat beside her, his face drawn, his hands clenched into fists. Lila and Ethan, sequestered in another room, were silent, their earlier bravado replaced by a hollow guilt. The official report was swift, accidental death. A fall caused by panic, by a desperate attempt to stop a family from breaking apart. But for Clara, James, and the twins, the ruling brought no closure, no relief. The secret that had unraveled their family was now forever tied to Margaret's death, a wound that would never heal. The days that followed were a blur of grief and recrimination. The house, once a place of memories, became a crime scene, its walls echoing with the weight of what had happened. The police came and went, their questions clinical, their presence a stark reminder of the tragedy's public face. Clara answered in a daze, her voice hollow as she recounted the events leading to the fall. James offered what details he could, his words clipped, his eyes avoiding the bloodstains on the stairs. The twins, questioned separately, spoke in fragments, their minds still grappling with the reality of what they'd done, what they'd caused. The investigation concluded quickly, no foul play, no charges, just a tragic accident. But the truth was far messier, far more devastating. Clara couldn't stay in that house, couldn't bear to walk its halls knowing what had transpired. She packed her family's belongings, her movements mechanical, her heart heavy with a grief she couldn't name. The betrayal was a knife in her chest, but the loss of her sister was a different kind of pain, one that cut deeper, that left her questioning everything she'd ever known. Margaret, the woman who had raised her, who had taught her right from wrong, had crossed a line so unthinkable it shattered Clara's understanding of her. How could the sister she'd admired, the one who'd held their family together through every storm, have fallen so far? The image of Margaret in that shower, with her children, was seared into Clara's mind, a wound that would never close. The twins, once the light of her life, were now strangers. Lila's sharp wit, Ethan's quiet strength, qualities Clara had once cherished, were tainted by their actions. She couldn't look at them without seeing the betrayal, without feeling the weight of their complicity. She made a choice then, one born of pain and necessity. She cut them off, refusing to let the poison of their secret destroy what little she had left. Lila and Ethan, barely 18, were sent to live with relatives, their futures uncertain, their guilt a constant shadow. Clara and James moved away, leaving the house and its memories behind, hoping distance could dull the pain. But the scars remained, etched into every moment, every thought. The rest of the family was drawn into the aftermath, the secret too big to contain. Clara reached out to her cousins, her aunts, her uncles, her voice trembling as she told them what had happened. Their shock mirrored her own, their disbelief a mirror of the pain she carried. Margaret had been a matriarch, a figure of strength, and now that image was gone, replaced by a truth too ugly to face. The family that had once gathered for holidays, for laughter, for love, was fractured beyond repair. Each member grappled with their own questions, their own grief, unable to reconcile the woman they'd known with the one who'd betrayed them all. The tragedy wasn't just Margaret's death, it was the loss of trust, the unraveling of bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. Clara would never fully heal, her heart torn between love for her sister and rage at her actions. James, too, carried the weight of a family he thought he knew, now forever altered. The twins, marked by their choices, faced a future haunted by guilt, their youth stolen by a secret they couldn't undo. And the question lingered, who was to blame? Was it Margaret, driven by a loneliness so deep it clouded her judgment? Was it Lila and Ethan, young but not innocent, who saw her weakness and exploited it? Or was it the sum of their choices, a collision of vulnerability and recklessness that led to this inevitable end? In the end, there were no simple answers. The lines between right and wrong had blurred, leaving only consequences. The Evans family, though here, the Hensleys, would never be whole again. The secret that had torn them apart would linger, a shadow over their lives, a reminder of how quickly love can turn to despair, how easily trust can shatter. And as they scattered, each carrying their own piece of the tragedy, one truth remained: some wounds never heal, some stories never find closure. In the shadows of every family, secrets wait to be uncovered, and for the Hensleys, this secret had destroyed everything they held dear.